Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for being here. Thank you for joining us for this evening's event, Incite Fiction as a Tempest. There was supposed to be a tempest tonight, but somehow it got sunny, so the title doesn't work that well anymore. This event is presented in partnership between the Vancouver Writers Fest and the Vancouver Public Library. Now, my name is Jorge Amigo, and I'm the head of cultural programming here for VPL. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And as an immigrant from Mexico myself and a settler in these lands, I think it's very important for me to say that I'm grateful to live and work here, and I am committed to learning about the ongoing effects of colonialism in this part of the world, and to bring that awareness into my daily work as a public servant. And with that, I want to encourage all of you to read and understand the history of this land and the people who've taken care of it for thousands of years, and what it means for all of us to live and work here. As you can see from the cameras back there, this event is being recorded, so if you have friends who couldn't make it, just tell them that they can watch it afterwards. And I have a very important favor to ask you. I know we're a small crowd, but it's very, very, very important that we all turn our cell phones off, because the dings and the beeps from our phones are very distracting, not only for those of us in the audience, but for the people on stage. So just take a second to mute or turn off your phones. Now, if you need to exit the room during the event, you can use that door or the one in the back. The washrooms are located right outside these doors to the right. And if there's a fire alarm, which we had one today actually, you can look for any of us who are wearing these badges, and we can direct you to where you need to exit. Now, without further ado, please welcome Leslie Hurtig, the Artistic Director of Vancouver Writers Fest.
Thank you so much, Jorge, and it's lovely to see all of you here tonight. Welcome. Good evening. We're thrilled to be able to host tonight Tsering Yangzom Lama and Janice Lynn Maher, two authors with adult debut titles that are emotionally rich and interwoven. We're so happy you could join us all here in person and also at home to hear these two authors speak about their new books, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies and Uncertain Kin. And I'm happy to say that both of these titles are available for sale tonight, along with our moderator, Eddy Boudel Tan's books over here, courtesy of Book Warehouse. So big thanks to them. We'd like to say thank you also to our Incite partners this evening, the Vancouver Public Library and TELUS, for their collaboration and support. Also, thank you to our government sponsors, the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the BC Government, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island. Without them, we simply couldn't put on events like this one and offer them for free. This is our 10th Incite event of the season, and on June 1st, you can join us here for our finale featuring a selection of shortlisted authors and books from the BC and Yukon Book Prizes shortlist. Also coming up is our special event with award-winning director, actor, and author Sarah Polley. She'll be speaking about her best-selling book of essays, Run Towards the Danger. That event will be held on May 30th at the Javavid Mofagian Theatre. Tickets are on sale now and can be found on our website. After this event, you will receive an email with a survey. We would love for you to fill that out because we read each and every one of them, and we take your suggestions quite seriously. We use them to make our events better. If you'd prefer to fill out a paper survey, we have some on the table over here as well. One lucky survey filler will be entered for a chance to win, or one will be drawn for a chance to win some books later. And now on to introduce our guests. Our moderator tonight is Eddy Boudel Tan. Eddy is an acclaimed author of two novels, After Elias, which was a finalist for the Relit Awards and the Edmund White Award, and The Rebellious Tide, which the Vancouver Sun reviewed as enticing, smile-inducing, and propulsive. Eddy was named a Rising Star by the Writers' Trust of Canada. His short stories can be found in Joyland, Yoke, and Gertrude Press, just to name a few, as well as in two forthcoming anthologies. Tsering Yangzom Lama joins us with her debut novel, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. a book which Kirkus Reviews calls a smart, sweeping story about the abuse and transformation of a culture stripped of its country. It is a beautifully written novel that speaks so closely to loss and displacement, as well as the connection to families and ancestral lands. I loved this book, and I kept checking to see if I'd read correctly, that it's a debut, because a debut from an author that writes like this, how can it be? It's just beautiful. Janice Lynn Maher is a different kind of debut author because she's no stranger to publishing books. She has 2 remarkable award-nominated and winning young adult titles under her belt. Uncertain Kin is her first collection for adults, and its early reviews are showing why she is a name we'll be hearing so much more about. Called a heart-wrenching, chilling, and hypnotizing collection, Uncertain Kin is a beautiful collection of 18 linked stories. Please welcome Eddy Boudel Tan, Tsering Yangzom Lama, and Janice Lynn Maher.
It is to be here in a room for Incite's second in-person event in 2 years. It feels really good to be here. I do want to take a minute just to thank the wonderful people at Vancouver Writers Fest, Vancouver Public Library, and TELUS for their commitment to bringing these events to our city and beyond so we can share space and share ideas and our love of literature. So hello to everyone here in the audience at the Central Branch of the Vancouver Public Library, and also everyone who is joining us online and on TELUS Optik TV. I've actually done more virtual events than in-person events, so I'm used to doing this in my sweatpants, you know, like business on top and comfort on the bottom. But, you know, the excitement of being here on this stage is well worth leaving the sweatpants at home. So I'm joined today with 2 really exciting and powerful voices in literature, and we're going to celebrate their 2 new books. I'm so excited to chat with you about them. They're 2 very interesting works of fiction, very different and distinct books, but with a lot of parallels that we are going to discuss. You know, they look at really powerful yet also provocative ideas and themes, and we're going to be talking about things like upheaval and conformity, belonging and womanhood. So before we dive into the deep end, Tsering and Janice, I just want to hear from you. How does it feel to have your books now out in the world so recently? Janice, why don't we start with you?
I'm tickled to have the characters set free because some of them have. Oh, thank you. Some of the characters in this collection of short stories have. Yeah, some of the characters in this collection have been with me for quite some time, either in my head or on the pages, waiting to find just the right home. So I'm glad to let them out and let them breathe and hopefully connect with readers.
Yes, well, congratulations again. And Tsering, your novel just came out yesterday, I believe. So
Yeah.
Brand new, congratulations.
Thank
How does it
you.
feel?
Well, it hasn't really sunk in yet. So it came out yesterday in the US, and then in Canada it'll be available in stores next Tuesday. So I don't know, I mean, writing this book, you know, it took many years, and most of the time I didn't actually know if it was possible. You know, I didn't actually know if I could do it. And that's really the experience of it is full of doubt and yet persistence. So I'm kind of astounded that I'm here, honestly, and it feels great. But it's also, I'm thinking of the next book right now. So, yeah, it's a lot of things at once.
I understand the instinct to think about what's next, but please take a moment or 2 or 3 just to sit back and celebrate and breathe and really enjoy every second of it. You know, my first book came out 2 years ago, and if I were to give any advice to any new author or debut author, I would say, just take a step back and really enjoy every second of the experience. Okay, so I have read both of your books, and I found them to be incredibly moving and incredibly powerful and so full of insight. So I'm really excited to just dive in and discuss your work with you and the ideas that you present in your book. And I mentioned earlier about parallels between your two books. They're very different, very, very unique, but there were a lot of parallels that I saw between these two works. And one of those parallels I found was upheaval, because the stories told in your books take place during times of incredible upheaval. And some of these moments are very intimate and personal, and others are on more of an historic scale. So Tsering, your book, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, begins in 1960, after the Tibetan uprising against Chinese occupation that led to the Dalai Lama fleeing in exile, along with much of the Tibetan population, which led to the collapse of Tibetan society and government. And so I'd love to hear from you, what compelled you to set your novel during such difficult and tragic times?
I mean, it's the story of modern Tibet, I would say, and it's the story of a lot of people around the world, of displacement and being stateless. That's something that we're seeing in the news right now. But for me, it really does come from the history that my family and my community have been reckoning with for the last 50-odd years. And it does begin with a military invasion that we certainly didn't invite, but we had to respond to. Everything that we held dear to was taken away. Our home, our freedoms, our sense of belonging to a place that we had been for thousands of years, that was all over. And to remain there was also a very difficult question that a lot of Tibetans had to face. And tens of thousands of Tibetans, like you said, decided to flee, but thinking that it was a temporary decision, thinking that this would just be until things calm down. And I know that, this is something that we hear from Ukrainians who have left too, like this is just until things are safe. But actually, in my novel, what you see is that over the course of many years, it slowly dawns on my characters that this is not a temporary thing, at least not in the way that they had imagined. Of course, for Tibetans in exile, there is still the promise, the long promise of home, of return. And that is a different element. That's really what makes it an exile as opposed to like a permanent situation. There's always that desire to return. And in exile, I think the moment of expulsion, that shock of being forced to leave, that is the story. That is a really important moment. And it's something that everybody is constantly thinking of. For me in this novel, I wanted to get beyond that typical story that most Tibetans think of and recast it with women at the center. So this is where it goes from the historic national narrative that some people might be familiar with here, and instead putting women at the center of it, which I think is an overlooked narrative. And so at the center of my book is a female village oracle. There was a male oracle that led the Dalai Lama into exile. He divined the path that the gods gave that led the Dalai Lama safely into exile. But in my story, there's a female oracle, a village oracle, who is far from the center of power, and she leads her village into exile. And that's where the story begins and takes off for about 50 years in the story of this family.
Yeah, reading your book, I was very fascinated, and it inspired me to learn more about the modern history of Tibet. I think, there is some level of consciousness of the travesties that have happened since the mid-20th century. But it inspired me to actually do some research and to better understand the history and the after effects of these tragic events. And something that I really quite loved about your novel is it centers on the humans, the people who were affected by these external forces that they had no control over, and seeing how those external forces shape their narrative. It was incredibly compelling and also incredibly heartbreaking, knowing that that struggle is still happening today. So thank you for that. Now, Janice, in Uncertain Kin, upheaval is also very prevalent, but I found in most of the stories, it came in forms that were more intimate and more personal. So an unexpected pregnancy, for instance, or a diagnosis of cancer. So what do you wish to reveal about your characters through these more personal moments of upheaval?
I think in the stories, I wanted to explore and sit with what happens, what do we do when either the familiar tragedy, like a cancer diagnosis, or something a little less common, like a child going missing or a child being abducted. What happens? I think sometimes I've observed the tendency for people to say when something terrible and uncommon happens, it's just unimaginable. I just can't imagine. But we can. We just don't want to. It's too uncomfortable. So I wanted to spend time with and sit with characters who do go through these things as everyday people do, and to understand what might they be thinking, what might they experience, and also to look at when there is something like a betrayal in a family, because with the title Uncertain Kin, the book does explore these tenuous family ties that don't always hold up as would be anticipated. And I wanted to understand and think about how do people end up where they are? How does a betrayer become a betrayer? What informs their story? So I wanted to move into upheaval and sort of think about it from different angles, different perspectives.
And something that I notice in many of your stories is many of them don't, or many of them do end without an explicit conclusion, allowing the reader to infer what happens next. So how do you decide when a story must end?
That's always an interesting question, and I think part of it is a bit difficult to explain, but it's a bit of a rhythm. It's kind of like when you bump into someone that you know and you chat for a period of time. You know what the rhythm is, and you know when it's time for the small talk to end, and you know, say your farewells and part ways. And I think of short stories as opposed to writing novels in a similar kind of way. In a novel, my experience at least, is delving in and sitting with characters for a longer period of time and moving through a long journey. With short story characters, it's more of a fleeting encounter. And you just kind of know, we've come here for something, for an atmosphere, for a feeling, for an understanding, for a brief moment of time, a little snippet of an experience. And when you have that, you've got it. And for me, it's just a kind of rhythm. Yeah. You know when you've obtained what you came for.
It's almost an intuition. Yeah, and I sometimes lack that when I'm having a conversation or doing something. Sometimes I just don't know when it should end, and it just keeps going and going. But I'm glad that you don't suffer from that.
Well, I think it happens in writing as well, too,
it does.
Doesn't it? But
it definitely
hopefully
does.
that doesn't make it into the finished book.
I will say, I think that's one of the, what I find at least to be one of the most challenging aspects of writing is knowing where to draw the line between being perhaps too obscure or too ambiguous versus being too overt or heavy-handed. But I will say, I think you have mastered that because you draw a very fine line, and I see that in your stories all throughout Uncertain Kin. So I think this might be a good time for us to hear some of the words in your books. So we'll let you do a short reading from each of your books. Janice, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I'll read a few pages from a story called The Water. I'll pick up partway through the story. So in this story, there's a kind of happening that takes place. And this happening is in progress, where we begin. I wake Monday morning to find my room buzzing. Mummy moved about like a dervish, gathering up 2 small dresses and discolored sheets. Church is having a donations drive, she announced from deep in my closet. What for? I rubbed my eyes. Once this storm hit, those people down south can need everything. Time for us to let our light shine. I picked out a handful of shirts that no longer fit and laid them at the edge of my unmade bed. The armpits were stained a permanent yellow, but people who were waiting for the storm to flatten their homes and flood their land might not care about sweat marks. I peeked into the hallway. Michael's door was open, several pairs of shoes piled beside a stack of clothes. Apparently, Mummy had taken her whirlwind in there too. Then, someone screamed. Michael burst out of his room. We both froze a moment before we shot into our parents' bedroom. No one was there. The bed was made, the bathroom door closed. My heart was pounding. I banged on the door. I could hear Mummy inside. She was making a low, moaning noise. Mummy, you hurt yourself? I rattled the knob. It wouldn't turn. Mummy, what happened? Open the door. Michael called from behind me. I could hear the tub filling, water splashing into water. It's all right, she said in a voice that was not. The door clicked open. Mummy was at the sink. She had started to undress. I had never seen my mother in only her bra before. For a moment, I forgot fear and was ashamed. What happened? Michael asked behind me. She pointed at the toilet. Thick red liquid filled the bowl. Had all that come out of her? How was she still standing up? My dinner threatened to creep up my throat. The thought of spitting into my mother's blood made me swallow it back down. Where is it from? My voice shook. She pointed at the bathtub. More blood. The tap, still on, gushed red into the tub, splashed it up onto the tiled wall. This was not from my mother. Michael fled. I could feel my mother shaking. I looked up at the ceiling. I expected its ordinary white to comfort me, but it felt like a lie. In the kitchen, our father was bent over the sink, retching. Beside him was a half glass of what could have been cherry juice. The 5-gallon bottle of drinking water by the fridge was stained the same way. I ran outside and turned on the hose. It stuttered, then gushed. It was as if an enormous vein had been slashed, spraying life into the morning. It was not only our home. The news told us that. At school the next day, everyone was quiet, keeping fuzzy teeth and night breath private, faces unwashed, underarms sprayed with deodorant, but underneath ripe. That afternoon, the rain, a remnant of the averted storm, fell clear and pooled crimson, as if the earth were contaminated. Michael said it wasn't blood. It couldn't be, because it didn't taste like blood, didn't taste at all. It was simply red and thicker than water, something like ponciana petals steeped in milk. We now ate off dishes wiped down with rubbing alcohol, and when that ran out, with Dettol. Even the best meal of macaroni and chicken and broccoli and beets becomes unpalatable when it smells like a nursing home floor. Water shipped in from Andros began to tinge as it drew near Nassau. The barges stopped coming on Wednesday. Juice and soda, which remained their proper color, shot up to $6 a can, then $8. Those who could fled for family islands. The problem had not spread there, though no one could say why. Is it voodoo? I asked Mummy as she emptied bottle after bottle of water into the sink. She did not reply. We could hear the TV on in the living room. The devastation is unparalleled, the reporter announced. Hundreds are feared dead, and even more missing after freak winter hurricane Raquel made landfall here just yesterday. My eyes drifted over to the stack of clothes and food on the counter. They seemed as useless as the tainted bottles. What would happen to those people waiting for my old shirts now that we had a disaster of our own? I looked up at Mummy to ask her if church was still having a drive, but her eyes seemed far away. Her hands, mechanical and firm, cracked the seal on another bottle and tipped it upside down. The liquid gurgled, set itself free.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Janice. And then we'll have Tsering reading from We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies.
Okay. So I'm still deciding what to read, but I'm gonna read from about 130 pages into the novel. At this stage, it's been 10 years that the characters have been at a refugee camp in Nepal. So this was meant to be a temporary thing, but now they've been there for 10 years. It's 1973. This is how the edges of our camp harden. We begin with the administrative building, pulling down the rotten grass-thatched walls, digging straight lines for a rocky foundation beneath the soil, mixing and slapping mortar with small sheets of metal in our palms. Climbing onto the roof, I see my old ropes, still holding the bamboo together. It gives me no pleasure to cut the still tight braids with my sickle, throw the dead, fraying grass into the gorge, and watch them float down for the goats and cows to pick through. From the flat hill overlooking our camp, I see the men lay down new roofs of corrugated tin sheets, putting in place small metal lakes that shine in the light. The sun multiplies before me and is never the same. Then the monsoon comes, and the rain too has changed. Against our tin roofs, the rain is no longer soft, wet taps from the sky, slipping onto our skin at all hours. Now the rain is made of nails, raging, threatening, though never breaking through. People now say with pride, our camp makes noise in the rain. We have no country, but we have a sound. In the same breath we wonder, why did we survive and not our kin? What separates us from the ones who were caught, who starved, who are lost in the mountains, who did not endure that last winter, that last season of illness or melancholy? When I look around, I know the truth. Nothing separates us. We are not the strongest, smartest, or even the ones who wanted to live the most. It can only be the saint, the ancient Gu, that through a series of karmic outcomes we cannot fathom, came to reside in our camp, amid our group of orphans and childless parents. This small figurine is precious because of all who have held him, wearing away at his gold patina and earthen body. On his form, we can see the traces of the devoted touch of so many people in places beyond our reach. The traces of my mother wrapping silk scarves around the Gu, my father's faint and final breaths, the unrelenting winds of the border, the shells that pounded a village into dust, my grandfather's wrinkled temple, and how many before that. Here, for 11 years, the saint has been carried from house to house to watch over our sick, our newly born, our betrothed, to enter into our dreams so we may emerge with lost memories and premonitions. But Ashang Mingmar doesn't like to call the Gu the nameless saint. Ashang says, we must find out his identity. We must take the Gu to a place where learned people can tell us his name. Maybe we need to go to Dharamsala, the seat of the exile administration and home of the Precious One.
Thank you very much, Tsering. So these various forms of upheaval create much of the tension and the conflict and the growth, having profound effects on your characters' lives. Tsering, in your novel, entire communities of Tibetans are forced to flee their land to find safety in Nepal, India, and elsewhere, leading to generations of Tibetans who have never stepped foot on their land. Two of your characters, Tenki and Doma, migrate to Canada in the 21st century, only to find a land of conditional promise. You know, they can gain some level of prosperity, but only if they behave a certain way and show enough gratitude. So what is it about the Canadian experience that you wish to illuminate through the eyes of these two characters?
So this is a difficult question, Eddie, but it's difficult for me because I don't know how to describe the Canadian experience. That feels almost impossible to describe. What I can say is, for my two characters that you mentioned, Tenki is the younger sister of the two girls that flee into exile, and she's the one that has the most promise in her refugee camp. She's seen as sort of the hope of the camp because she's quite brilliant. And so she becomes the first one to go to school, to university, and sort of has the highest sort of, everybody hopes that she will become something in her camp. And tragically, that because of her circumstances and her life, she almost has the farthest to fall. And coming to Canada, she becomes a cleaner. And it's not because she's not brilliant. She's taught to be a teacher, but she cannot achieve, what her mind is capable of. And so I don't think that for Tenki, that prosperity is really on offer. I think what's on offer for her is safety and some stability in this country, and a sense of having a citizenship, for a stateless person, which is meaningful. But it's not the mythos that is promoted, of Canadian multiculturalism and all of us belonging. That's not necessarily something that is accessible to all immigrants. And so that has a great deal to do with privilege and the accident of one's birth in history, right? Doma, her niece, is also seen as somebody with a lot of promise, but she has a easier chance, I guess, of finding entry into Canadian academia, which is where she wants to be. She wants to be a professor. She wants to be a scholar. However, I think the most important thing with Doma's journey in this novel is that she begins with one idea of what it is that she wants to accomplish, which is, I guess, this notion of prosperity that you're speaking of, right? To accomplish one's goals within this idea of a meritocracy, that this is a land in which if you work hard, you can achieve things, because what matters is your hard work, and that's ultimately the only barrier. And I think this myth is much stronger in America, actually, having lived in the U.S. for the last 10 years. But for Doma, in the process of in the novel, she eventually comes to find herself questioning a lot of this promise, and actually finds that she has another set of values that comes from her family and from her culture. And her story is really about trying to understand where she really wants to be, and it's not completely bought into the national narrative, I guess, of prosperity or what that looks like. So the two characters have very different experiences in that sense.
Yeah, and I found myself really relating to Doma in a lot of ways as a second-generation Canadian myself. And one scene has really stuck with me. So there is a scene in which Doma, the aspiring scholar, is having a conversation with one of her professors. A Canadian professor. He's very well-established, very distinguished, and also older. And he's interrogating her almost, asking her questions like, where did you study in India? And how did your parents afford the tuition? How were you able to make it to Canada? And it strikes Doma as not just intrusive, but it strikes her how that professor would not tolerate those kinds of questions being asked of him. And it just really highlighted this interesting insight that I think a lot of foreigners just deal with day to day and being in a foreign land.
I think for me with that scene, in that scene, the power dynamic still in his mind is that he is the one studying and she is the object to be studied. And so he is asking her questions because she should be open to all the things he wants to know. But this is about her subjectivity. This is literally in her perspective. And so she is seeing the world too, and she also has questions. And so what she wishes for is a meeting of equals, a meeting of, mutual respect and conversation where one's details about one's personal lives come out about naturally, as opposed to what he expects is that she is to be studied and to be known in the way he wants to know her.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's something that I didn't mention was he was a professor in Tibetan culture and history, which is very interesting. He is an expert in the field from a scholarly standpoint, speaking to someone who is born of that culture that he's studying, and yet that power dynamic still exists, which was really, really interesting and insightful. Okay, so you did raise an interesting point about the Canadian experience. What is that exactly? I don't necessarily know. And Canada is going through this time of reckoning. We can no longer believe in this vision of a just and equitable society when faced with the history of oppression and suffering that Canada has, even as our government strives to acknowledge the past and heal its wounds. Immigrants are arriving in this country today, dealing with their own struggles of belonging and identity and acceptance. So, Janice, let's start with you. Most of Uncertain Kin takes place in the Bahamas, but there's one story, Boyo, which centers on a Bahamian family settling in Vancouver. Here, the mother and the youngest son struggle, perhaps more so than the others, to fit in, to find their place here. And what I found so insightful about this story is that the alienation that they encounter is much more implicit than it is overt. So what do you wish readers to take away from this story? And does that differ between readers who would be perhaps immigrants or newcomers versus those who are not?
So in this story, I think with the mother, Denise, whose point of view the story is told from, as opposed to Boyle, who the story is named for, and who's one of three of her children. There are kind of these two different ways of being in this new place. Boyo is, a small boy, and he wants to continue to do the things that he has always done, which causes his mother great alarm when she wakes up and finds him outside investigating nature. And when he's sort of pushing away from the expectations, escaping from school and scampering around, checking out birds and stones, and he has a sort of innocence and freedom. And on the other hand, I think with Denise's character, who is grappling with things like a rejected work permit, feeling scolded at the grocery store because she's using the wrong terminology for what she calls cassava, and what her teenage daughter, who seems to be fitting in quite well, is quick to haughtily point out the what she should be calling it. And I think for readers, for me at least, writing the story, to come at it from a slightly different point of view, I thought about different ways of moving around and being in a new place, in a different place. There's a child who adjusts and adapts and seems to feel like she's faring fairly well. There's a younger child that just kind of does his own thing and doesn't seem to be particularly bothered about where he is. There's another child that insists on being as wild and free as he wants to be. And then there's this mother caught in the middle, seeing some children that she worries about, others that she feels are slipping away, and herself feeling like I can't work here. I don't even feel like I have the right to be here. And I think it's it's an interesting question as to whether I would want someone who is an immigrant to take something different from the story versus someone who is not an immigrant. I confess when I wrote it, I probably thought a little more selfishly and thought about myself from an immigrant point of view. But I think for all of us, whether we think of ourselves as immigrants or not, and I always find it interesting who thinks of themselves as an immigrant. I'm sure those who are first generation immigrants or, perhaps are perceived as looking like, oh, you must be from somewhere else. Some of us may have had experiences of, I've certainly had the experience of, people wanting to know, where are you from? And if you list the name of somewhere in the Lower Mainland, they want to know, but where are you really from? And they seem taken aback when, they receive the same question, and where are you from? But where are you really from? So I think wherever one falls on this side of immigrating recently or from some time in the past, or not at all, I think it's a matter of looking at how we move around in the world. What do we do? Are we like Boyo, sort of living joyfully and sort of innocently pushing back against expectations? Are we feeling like we don't have the right to push back? Are we feeling judged by the way that we move through the world, or simply who we are?
Yeah, I think you raise a really interesting point that's underscored so beautifully in the story Boyo, similar in that there is no universal Canadian experience. There's also no universal migrant experience. And, with that story focusing on one family and showing how every individual in that family's experience is so different as they try to settle into a new place, it really brought that to life in an insightful way. Okay, so Tsering, next question for you. So from my experience, immigrants often make sacrifices. So they, make compromises in their language, in their clothing, in their customs for the, benefit of being able to settle and assimilate in a new land. So how does your novel reflect the ways in which immigrants make sacrifices?
I think, so in terms of sacrifices, there is a sense of a generational scale, I guess, with my characters. And I think this is a common theme among immigrant stories, where one sacrifices for the next generation to have some chance of like a good life, a life without struggle. And so one sees oneself in relation to other people. There's a sense of the success is something that goes beyond your personal experience, because you face the limitations so clearly for yourself. And that's why I think my book is also structured in this way. It took me many years to find the structure for this book, but it's structured as daughters, sisters, lovers, self. And in each section, there are two characters, and we go from one person's experience to another. And the reason I did that is because I do believe that my characters' identities are relational. Who they are is determined by who they are to each other. And sacrifice in this case is something that all of my characters do for each other in order to, out of love and out of a desire for survival beyond the self. When you're coming from a state of literally statelessness, having no papers, no citizenship to any nation, and you feel like you're basically a guest, a perpetual guest in other people's countries, you start to believe that you have to behave a certain way to have a place, right? This model immigrant sort of idea that this is put out there. If one person from that group behaves badly, it reflects on everybody, this idea. And I think that's a very destructive and damaging narrative, but it's an understandable one. I guess that's the flip side. The beautiful side of it is that you can see your successes as something that you share and that the struggle is something that's meaningful. So one thing that I really believe is that, if you make your character suffer, which I certainly do in my book, and this comes from Nabokov, he talks about how if he makes his character suffer, he wants there to be meaning in that suffering, that there is an ethical element to making a character suffer, because this is your decision as a writer. And I believe that to be true for me as well. So my characters sacrifice a great deal, but the meaning in that is just as important. And the meaning of that is in their love for each other, in their relationships within each other, even when it's difficult, even when they cannot communicate to each other what they really are, who they really feel, like they are, and what they really want. Sometimes there are lots of layers that prevent people from speaking the truth, but that suffering that they experience is always about each other, about their relationships, and I think that's where the meaning comes. So that's how I think about sacrifice in this book.
Yeah, and something that I really admired about your characters is their strength. They are some strong, bold women, and this sounds terrible, but the suffering is really what made them stronger and allowed them to, embrace their strength and lean on each other and overcome everything that was thrown at them, and that was done very beautifully. So I could keep talking forever, but I do want to give some time to take questions from the audience. But before I do that, I do have one last question for each of you. I would love to hear, what is the one thing that you would like everyone to know about your books? How about we start with you, Janice?
I think I would say that they were written gently, and I would say to read them gently. The stories do often deal with painful or difficult experiences, and I know that there's a lot of conversation about joy, and I'm starting to feel, as a Black writer, almost a pressure to write more joyful things. I encounter it in comments or in questions and inquiries. Well, we need joyful stories. We don't just need traumatic stories. And I think it's an interesting perspective and point of view, and not one without context and history and background. But I think that in writing about challenging topics, there is, for me, an attempt to balance, because in life there is pain, there is difficulty, there is trauma, there is strife, there are challenges, hardships. And there are also moments of joy. Good experiences, magical moments of beauty. So I think I would want readers to know that the stories and the characters were written with the intent of gentleness, and to turn an eye to what is sometimes overlooked, and to sit with and try to make sense of what is difficult to understand. So I would offer that as my intent, and to extend an invitation to try and read it in the same vein.
Thank you. I can say that I definitely got that through reading Uncertain Kin. If not joy, and there was joy in the stories, I saw great beauty, no matter whether it was joy or suffering or grief or guilt or longing. Beauty was prevalent throughout every story. So thank you. Tsering, how about you?
I really like what Janice said about this wanting to have both joy and also to tell the story, of suffering and sorrow too. Like, that also resonates with me. Like, this to me feels like a both. But like for me, I guess the message that would be most important to convey is that I tried to write as honestly as I could, and to see this experience or these experiences of these characters with an unvarnished eye, and to present it without a glossy veneer of any sort. And so there are ways in which all of my characters are implicated as well, as well as implicating the world at large. So yeah, that's how I tried to write with honesty.
Wonderful. I love that. Okay, so you've probably had enough questions for me. So why don't we turn it to the audience, whether in the room or for viewers who are watching online. Does anyone have any questions for Janice or Tsering? All right, we have a question up front here.
I was wondering if you have anything in your work right now and what your next book is being about.
Okay, just to repeat, the question is, do you have anything in the works right now, and what can we expect next? How about Janice, why don't we start with you?
So for me, I do have another YA novel that I'm currently working on called Where Was Goodbye, which should probably be coming out next year. And that story follows, in that story we meet a young woman, a teenager, who's, just before the story begins, her older brother has died by suicide. So the story is about her search for answers, understanding her struggle with, is there something that I missed? Is there something that I could have done differently? Am I to blame? Is anyone to blame? So that's what I'm currently working on, and there are some other short story delvings that are going on a little bit further down the line. There are always ideas floating around.
I've been thinking about this next project for about a year, and there's a passage early on in my book where one of the villagers says to the mother oracle, she's basically refuses to do premonitions at the border. She's not feeling well. Her husband has just died. Spoiler, but it happens pretty early, so it's okay. And he says, how can you not, help us? You are somebody who can ride on the backs of tigers. You can fly across the sky. You have, superhuman strength. And I wanted to write in this next book a world in which all of that is true. So this is a world before colonization, in which all of the things that traditional Tibetan beliefs say is true is actually treated as real. And I want to set it in an unnamed time, in an unnamed place, so I can free myself of the historical strictures and really go wild with my imagination. So that's the next thing, and I've been researching for a few months and taking notes, and I've written a few pages, so I'm really itching to get back into it after all of this promotional work is done, which is also great, obviously. But that's the next book, I think.
Wow, exciting stuff. Looking forward to seeing that one day. So I think we had a question right over there.
Yeah, for Tsering, I hope I'm not asking too personal of a question, but you mentioned that this book had taken you many years to write. And I was wondering, is that just because you found it a very difficult story to write, or was life of the other parts of your life getting in the way?
Well,
So just quickly, I'll just repeat that for the audience watching from home. So the question was, Tsering, you'd mentioned that it had taken you quite some time to write this book. What was the reasoning for it taking as long as it did?
So I began writing this book in my first year in the MFA program. So I had no excuse at that time. I should have written so much, but I was busy figuring out what I was even doing. And I spent about 4 years just writing the characters doing random things. And then I finished a draft and I said, okay, what is this? And I realized I needed to do a lot more research. So I spent about a year in the stacks just reading a ton of scholarship. And that's when the book really came alive for me. And I realized there are all these cultural things that I was fascinated by, which the book contains, the oracular practice, which is an ancient tradition in Tibet, like the Greeks, the oracles of ancient Greece. That's kind of how old Tibetan oracular practice is, and it was threatened by the invasion, but it still persists. And also, the Terma tradition, which is a tradition of hidden texts all across Tibet that were left as teachings for Tibetans. So all these things started to come about, and I became fascinated with them, and then I started to figure out how to utilize them in the text, how to make them a part of the narrative. And in a sense, I felt like I was building a bridge to a country that I couldn't go to. And I was building a bridge to all the things that exile has denied me, this culture, this heritage. And so that became a really rich but very slow process because, being in exile, I have limited source materials. I have to work with what I can find. And even to have libraries like at Columbia, I was very privileged to even have access to those books, without having to spend thousands of dollars trying to track them down. So it was a slow process. I also trekked to the border to see the landscape, to experience the land that people escape through. So it was a very, very slow process of researching and figuring out the book after I had already written it, writing it all over again.
All right, we have a question for both of you that has come through online. So both of you have physically come from so far, the Bahamas, Nepal, and this idea of place and movement is so important to both of your works. In your stories, movement is sometimes related to displacement. Do you both feel like you now have roots here in Vancouver? And can there ever be comfort in movement, roaming many lands and distances? Janice, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, the idea of roots is always interesting. I think of plants that, like air plants, that don't necessarily have roots. I've been in Vancouver for almost 20 years now. And place is always an interesting thing to think about. In ways, yes, you get to know a place, you get familiar with a place. You have ties, and in those ways you have roots. And at the same time, there are roots that exist somewhere else. So some roots are more present and some are across distance, I would say.
Yeah, I share Janice's ambivalence or, hesitance about the roots question. I will say that the obsession of this book was not Canada. The obsession of this book was a land that is completely denied to me, and in which I literally cannot go, and I couldn't even get into Hong Kong, which you don't need a visa as a Canadian to get into. So that was the obsession of this book. I do want to write about Canada at some point, actually, because I immigrated here when I was 11, and I had some really interesting experiences. I lived in Coquitlam, near the train tracks, right next to the sanatorium there, and I used to go rollerblading there. I had really great experiences that I could somehow fictionalize, I think, and I do feel rooted to that experience, if not deeply this land. And I think that is a different kind of root, maybe an air plant route, I'm not sure, but it's something that I haven't yet delved into and thought deeply about because I have been so nomadic in my life, actually. I've lived in New York for the last 10 years, and I'm here now, and I was in Canada before that, but then before that I was in Nepal. So there's something there to explore for sure, though.
Okay, so it looks like we have a question in the audience.
a great question. All the questions have been great, so thank you. It's really thoughtful. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the question was, how do you work through the tension between wanting to tell your stories and then also to not, I suppose, give in? How did you put that last part? Sorry, just you put it so well.
Sometimes I forget what I said seconds ago. But I think this, like, how do you tell your story but also refuse to be looked at?
Yeah. Okay. So how do you tell your story while also avoiding being scrutinized or overly scrutinized by the reader?
This is something that I'm figuring out literally live. But what I will say is that I try to be very deliberate about speaking for myself at every point, because the overwhelming desire is for you to speak for a group of people, especially if that group of people has not had a stage like this. But in my work, I will say that I am not here to provide any easy narratives. And if the reader goes away from this book still believing what they believed at the beginning of this book, then I don't think I've done my job. As a writer, I'm trying to, if a reader has an interest in these topics, I'm trying to reach for something beyond with them. I'm trying to connect with them at a deep level so that they can see something new, something that compels them and, ideally, like, broadens both of our, this has certainly broadened my perspective, and I hope that it has that ability to broaden another reader's perspective. If they are engaging with this, they have to bring the rest of it. This book is incomplete, this is just text on a page. So I really believe that the reader comes in here and fills in the rest, and they bring in their intelligence, their heart, their receptivity to these words, and they make the magic as well happen, because literally these are just words on a page. And somehow, over the course of 10 hours, we will spend that time together. And so if in that time I haven't provoked something new, I haven't rattled something in their minds, then that's a problem for me as a writer to contend with and push myself. And I think that happens only if I do that for myself as well. So again, it's like anything else. I feel like the practice of writing is a long and slow practice of trying to become a better seer of the thing that you're interested in seeing. And that takes a long time to see the world better. I actually say, like, oh, writers all want to change the world, but I think a better way to say it is actually writers all want to see the world very clearly, and that is a really hard thing to do. So I'm just kind of rambling at this point, but I hope that kind of gets across what I was saying, which is, like, I begin with myself to try to be really honest and to try to challenge myself in the text. And I think that a reader who is meeting me halfway, hopefully they will also experience that same sort of experience that I had of transformation, even in a small way.
And Janice, did you have a different perspective on that?
I would say it's a really tender question, the question of what do we share, what do we reveal. And I think for me, in Uncertain Kin and these stories, a lot of the stories do center around secrets, things that are hidden, some things that some might say or might feel should be hidden. And I think the wonderful thing for me as a writer of fiction is that it is fiction. It's not. It doesn't feel as bearing as I would imagine, a memoir might. So what I feel comes out as far as myself is what the things that I choose to write about show what captures my interest, what caught my eye, what bothers me, what keeps me up at night, what irritates me, what confuses me, what I'm trying to understand. So I feel like the characters are kind of buffering the vulnerability a bit. It's their their secrets and their pain. And I think that eases it a bit for me as a writer. It feels a little, we share the vulnerability as opposed to it being, my personal stories necessarily that I have to juggle. But there's still an element, and I think particularly as a writer from a country that is quite small and often not particularly well represented in any arena, or not represented at all. It's a question, and it can be kind of a scary responsibility. Am I representing accurately? I'm only representing my point of view, but should I be writing about this? Am I telling our business to the world? Are these family secrets I should keep for myself? But then I think this comes back to the question of writing honestly. So I hope that answers. Those are kind of my thoughts. But I think it's an ongoing sort of push and pull. What do I reveal? Should I write about that topic? And I think for me as a writer, if a topic feels scary and secret, that's a hint that I feel like I am almost obligated to explore it initially for myself, and then sometimes it ends up being shared.
That was beautifully said from you both. Now, I wish we could go on and chat further, but being mindful of the time, we are at time. So thank you so much for being here with us and discussing your works. I'm very excited to continue celebrating your two books, and I hope you do too. Take the time, not think about the next thing, really savor every moment and enjoy it all, because this only happens once per book. So really enjoy it. And to everyone who is joining us today in person and online, thank you again for taking the time to be here with us. It's been so lovely sharing this space with you and seeing your faces in real life, in 3D. So thank you. We do have their books ready at that table by Book Warehouse, where you can purchase a copy. So I do encourage you to pick up a copy of We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies and Uncertain Kin. And Tsering and Janice will also be there signing copies as well. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Eddy.
Thank you so much, Tsering, Janice, and Eddy, for this lovely conversation and for sharing so much of yourselves. And all of you who joined from home as well, thank you for tuning in. As you were saying, the books are right there, and they're going to be signing on that table. Before I let you go, since you're a literary audience, I want to share about two events coming up soon. So tomorrow, upstairs in the Amant Albano Theatre, we're hosting a conversation with Sri Lankan Canadian author Shyam Silvadurai. And he wrote a book called Mansions of the Moon about Yasodhara, the wife of Siddhartha Gautama. And that's going to be in a conversation with Shirish Rao, who's the executive director and artistic director, of the Indian Summer Festival. That's tomorrow. And then next week on Tuesday, in this very room right here, Elamin Abdel Mahmoud, who you may know from BuzzFeed News or from the CBC's Power and Politics panel or his podcast on pop culture called Pop Chat. He's going to be chatting with the director of the UBC School of Journalism, Kamal Al-Solaili, about his memoir about coming to Canada from Sudan and what it's like to belong in Canada. So that's on Tuesday. It's going to be amazing. And that's all I got for you tonight. Have a wonderful night. Thank you for coming.